Welcome back to Houston Life. Joining us now to help understand how families can cope with a tragedy like this is relationship expert Dr. De'Avon Young. Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, you guys.
Yeah.
So, luckily, in this scenario, we know the shooter is dead, but oftentimes in a mass shooting scenario, there's tremendous loss of life, and there's also just the violation of knowing that your shopping center, the places where you like to hang out, have suddenly become a crime scene. So where do we begin, doctor, to try to make sense of an event like this?
Well, first thing, the shooter may be dead, but the nightmare that's going to live on inside of the heart, in the minds and in the imaginations, even the dreams of the victims, is far from dead. It's only beginning. This can trigger anxiety. It triggers depression. But more than anything, there's going to always be this heightened sense of paranoia where if you were involved or you had someone close to you that was involved in this thing, there will be an anxiety that follows this, and that anxiety could literally last for the rest of a lifetime if not dealt with properly.
What about like those like us that were sitting there watching this on the news? I don't mind saying I live just a few blocks from where this happened. So, you know, for me, I'm like, wow, this is kind of just in my neighborhood. You know, when you're watching it on TV and you've got kids, how do you even just dive into this conversation? Unfortunately, we seem to have almost weekly now.
Well, a couple of things we have to consider. Don't take for granted that every day is going to be filled with some atrocious outcome.
Okay.
Remembering that life has as much beauty as it does pain, because it does balance itself. But in dealing with especially small children or the elderly about this thing is not to overindulge it. Don't make this the centerpiece of conversation. Don't allow this to become the first thing that pops in your head when you pass by that place or that street, and especially if you had loved ones that experience this trauma. If they want to talk about it, then talk about it. But if they don't force that conversation. If anything, remember that life has balance and look for the beauty of life. Don't get caught up in the nightmares of life.
A moment ago, doctor, you mentioned the anxiety we may feel. I mean, there was a Walgreens there's a grocery store. So for people who maybe are feeling a bit of fear, even going to the grocery store, how do you recommend we cope with anxiety that can be triggered?
Well, the first thing, let's triage that into levels. If you know that this thing really has you wound up, you might want to see a professional and get some professional intervention. However, if this is just a thought where now you're overly cautious, you're kind of scared to go back to that store, simply just don't go back to that store until you feel better. Don't allow this thing to take control of you. It's the most important thing. But we do have to be mindful. We do have to be vigilant. And we live in such a time that we must concern ourselves with what could happen, but let's not focus too much on these things that could happen. Here's the reality. 95% of what you worry about will probably not happen, and the 5% that does happen, if you prepare properly, you do what you can with it.
How do you deal with, you kind of touched on it a little bit, you know, with mom who's 77 years old or mom who's 85 years old, and you know, just so wrapped up in, oh, what does this world come to these days? And you know, it seems like every day we're having a shooting. How do you deal with a situation like that?
That's understandable, because our seniors are often terrified anyway, because when you're dealing with somebody that can't get in a car and escape quickly, or that does not have the mobility to get up and run or flee or what have you, one of the best things that we can do is start reaching out to those people, comforting them, let them have the time to talk about what's bothering them, and you reassure them in a loving way. Do not be dismissive. Don't have a condescending attitude when you talk to these people, but make sure that you let them know that, you know what, you do have valid concerns, but let's look at the good part. We have law enforcement out there that's doing one heck of a job. They often don't get credit for it. We have, by being active ourselves and paying attention to what's going on around us, we can find new ways to do the same thing, and hopefully that can alleviate some of that stress. But the best thing you can do is be compassionate and listen and let someone feel that you care and that they feel heard.
Oh,
Dr. Young, what about the importance of routine? Because I know a moment ago you mentioned if we're feeling uncomfortable, maybe we should just avoid that area. But I've heard many times that the best thing we can do is to go about our business and to get back out there essentially not stay
Yeah.
at home and just sit in a corner hiding in fear. So is there a balance of avoiding the area while at the same time getting on with your life and going back and buying your groceries without fear?
It's perfectly normal to have fear and anxiety, but what becomes distracting and disconcerting is when you allow fear and anxiety to have you. So there is a point in time that you do need to go, come out your bubble, go back to the center, and if that means you don't get out the car, but you just start by simply driving through or driving by, or that means that sometimes if you park and you don't feel safe getting out, don't let that stop you. Return to your normal life. This is what hurts all of us when we allow the acts of deranged, demented, or even just depressed people to take over our lives in such a way that not only do they who need to be incarcerated or not, but then we become mentally and emotionally incarcerated ourselves because of their heinous acts.
All right, Dr. De'Avon Young, thank you so much for the tips.